Hello. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Hi. It's been a long day, and I know the lunch was a little bit late, but thanks for coming back. Can I please ask the panelists to sit on the podium, please? So, the second day of our two-day conference started with a somewhat deceptive title of Crisis Planning and Industrial Policy, and it ended up being a panel on delinking, and of course talking about the African situation, looking at Sri Lanka, and looking at how what are the options available for Global South countries to delink. And then our second panel was commemorating the Bandung spirit. We heard about the different views of Nkrumah and Nairiri from Sabato. We also heard about the Sri Lankan context and the Latin American context. And this panel is really moving into the way forward, or the new direction, or a new era of multilateralism. And we have a great set of speakers who will guide us into different approaches from a multidisciplinary background. Not that this was only about economics so far. It was a very political conference focusing on political economy issues for the Global South. So we will start with Dr. Freedom Mazwe, who is from Zimbabwe. Freedom is a senior lecturer at the University of Zambia, and his research focuses on land and agrarian questions. He has worked as a senior researcher and project manager for more than a decade at the Sam Moyo African Institute for Agrarian Studies in Harare, and currently he serves as a coordinating committee member of the Agrarian South Network, a tricontinental network founded for advanced studies, and he's also a lecturer at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. He's also a member of 𝒂𝒓𝒔. So over to you, Freedom.
Thank you, Farah, for the introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this platform at a historic event where we commemorate 70 years of Bandung. So, as Farah had indicated, while in this session I was supposed to talk about the way forward. Right. My original talk was meant to be on Pan-Africanism, the link between Pan-Africanism and Bandung. But there have been some contributions that have been made, especially in the previous panel by Comrade Sabato. So now, and yesterday we had some presentations which gave an economic dimension. So now I'll change focus a bit to start to talk about the land and agrarian questions in the Global South, in the context of Bandung, and try to link them with Bandung to show how important they are and how they should be addressed for the betterment of the Global South. But in all our work, we remain inspired by Kwame Nkrumah, who stated that it is our duty to build, unite, and develop. So we don't have to subcontract any development processes, but we have to do it on our own as a people from the Global South. So when we look at the land and when we look at Bandung and its initial stated principles and objective of sovereignty, independence, and self-determination, these issues or questions could only be addressed by addressing historic land and agrarian imbalances, right? When the leaders in Bandung met, they were talking about the need for self-determination, end to colonialism and sovereignty. And this cannot happen as long as the reclamation of land has not taken place. Because through colonization, people, indigenous populations, they were displaced from their land, right? So not only people were they dispossessed, but also colonialism undermined local industrial development in the global south through what Bruno yesterday described as the international division of labor, right? We continue to be producers of primary commodities that will be exported to Europe mainly. If we look at the economy of Sri Lanka today, like any economy in Africa, you find that we rely much more on exporting primary commodities that were introduced under colonialism: tea, coffee, rubber, right? So we are dependent economies. So the spirit of Bandung was supposed to bring this to an end, right? Was supposed to bring this to an end. Initially, I said by the reclamation of land, and secondly, by also what my colleagues, previous speakers like Ndongo, identified as delinking, right? Delinking also means building your own industrial base, right? So, I mean, even there were various forms of colonialism, right? In the whole of global south, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And if we look at Africa, Sami Amin actually came to develop 3 macro regions, right, to describe the nature of colonialism. There was the Africa of the colonial trade or peasant economy, mainly found in West Africa. I'm sure this also can relate in some parts of Asia and Latin America. In this part of the continent, the peasantry was left intact, right? The peasants were not displaced from their land, but their nature of crops which they grew, they were changed by the colonial system to suit colonialism, right? That's Africa of the colonial trade. Then we have Africa of the concessional companies, found mainly in Central Africa, DRC, and other countries where plantations were established, right? And I'm sure if you look again here in Asia, you will still see the same. Then there was the third category which he identifies, I mean is the Africa of the labor reserves, or the former secular economies, where there was massive land alienations or displacements, where people were removed from their lands. Countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Kenya, just to name a few. So here there was massive land alienation. So at independence, in most of our countries, we see that there was no structural change, right? There was no structural change. The land questions, they were not addressed. And also, we continue to be suppliers or producers of raw products, right? And yet, this was a moment when the Bandung principles were supposed to lead to economic development. But suddenly we see structural adjustment programs, right, being introduced in many countries, not only in Africa, but also Asia and Latin America, right? And by structural adjustment programs, it led to the abandonment of state planning. Introduced new tenure systems, right? That is the promotion of land titling, right? Promotion of freehold tenure. And more broadly, structural adjustment programs opened our economies. They became more vulnerable, right? So under structural adjustment program, we see the perpetuation of land concentration, right, from foreign entities from the West. They come in to buy land, displacing locals. That is happening. So, under structural adjustment, we see the perpetuation of what I can say, neocolonialism, colonial domination in some other ways. So we see it in the land sector. We see it in the sector, and we see the lives of peasants worsening during this period. There's withdrawal of state support. We see peasants in Africa today being displaced by foreign entities, right? Working with the local state, right? So the neoliberal period sees the perpetuation of inequalities, right? Which is primitive accumulation. And for others for other scholars in the Agrarian South, which is a journal actually founded by scholars from the Africa, Asia, and Latin America, they point out that we still have problems in the global South, which they say is the agrarian question. And for them, the agrarian question is a question of wrestling, taking away, or fighting for global agriculture, right? Agrarian question today is a question of fighting for global agriculture, land, and other natural resources from the predatory logic of monopoly finance capital and of submitting them to the logic of autonomous, egalitarian, democratic, industrial, and sustainable development for the benefit of all peoples of the world. So here they identify that under neoliberalism, we now see the dominance of monopoly capital, which is now continuing with the logic of appropriating natural resources, land, and even industries from the people of the South. Hence, we see many problems today. We see people fighting for their land rights everywhere today. We see people not being in employment, right? And we see also commodities being exported at a cheap price. So the major task is to fight for the natural resources so that all of us can benefit. So we see that the neoliberal economic policies or structural adjustment programs made us to deviate from the Bandung spirit. And that is imperialism at work. That is what Kwame Nkrumah had warned us before, that this would happen. So for these scholars, neoliberalism did not end the agrarian question as claimed by some, but it relaunched the agrarian question of monopoly finance capital. That is, monopoly finance capital has now come to be too powerful, more than anything else, right? Leading to the pauperization of the majority of the people. Hence, majority of people, poverty today has been escalating in the global south. We are now much more reliant on food imports. We are no longer producing our own food. We are now more reliant on food imports. And during this period, countries that attempt to implement land reforms, they are met with punitive measures. They are sanctioned. For example, we have the case of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe undertakes a radical land reform in 2000, and as a result of that, it is isolated, it is sanctioned. The economy is not performing well today. And we have the current case of South Africa. We know that the South African president was summoned to the US, and we know that the reasons basically is not genocide, but is the issue of land. There is fear that if South Africa might undertake a land reform. So the idea here is to strike fear into the South African government and its people so that they don't undertake or implement a radical land reform. So these are some of the effects of neoliberalism, structural adjustment program under neocolonialism. What's the way forward? What's the way forward now? I have been trying to articulate the challenges since colonialism to the post-independence phase, looking at the land and agrarian sector. What's the way forward? And for Semoyo and Parisidos, they argue that to we cannot address the national question without addressing the agrarian question, land and agrarian question. So the most important thing is to address the agrarian questions. How? Implement land reform, so that we address inequalities where they exist. Protect the land rights of vulnerable groups, women, peasants. How do we achieve that? By reforming land tenure, by implementing land tenure reforms, right? We also need to see the state coming in and supporting farmers in the global south. The retreat of the state in the 80s and 90s has caused untold suffering on the peasant. So we need to see the state coming back with various forms of support. It could be price support systems, subsidies, all those kind of things. Promotion of cooperatives, that is important. And public sector and private sector partnerships, they are also must also be experimented with and tried. But in doing all this, in undertaking all these initiatives, there is need to depart from neoliberalism, right, towards embracing other alternatives, and it could be socialism or any other alternatives, right? We need to revisit those. We need to revisit Pan-Africanism as a guiding ideology, guiding framework. The Bandung spirit has to be revisited again. For Africa, we'll need to go back to the Lagos Plan of Action, which we think was quite useful and had a good vision for the content. The Lagos Plan of Action of 1980. So it's a shift. We need a shift from neoliberal economic order, right, towards embracing other alternatives. We also need to see resistance, right? Resistance from below. farmers challenging corporate control over their agriculture. We need to see resistance, defending their land rights from below. That has to happen. And lastly, when we talk of Pan-Africanism and the Bandung, it must not end at the state level, but it must, the principles of Bandung and Pan-Africanism must go down to the community level, to the people, right? It must not end at community level. Because we have to do away with discriminatory practices that are found at the local level based on race, ethnicity, caste, all those kind of things. That's what I mean when you say the principles of Bandung. Those are principles of equality, remember, self-determination. So equality must not be amongst states alone, but equality must be promoted even at a lower level. Lastly, solidarity remains key. Thank you.
Thank you, Freedom. I'm very also pleased to now announce the next speaker. His name is 𝒔𝒕𝒉, and he is from Palestine. He cannot join us, but he has recorded a video for us. And 𝒔𝒕𝒉 is a Palestinian student of social thought and economy and policy at Al-Quds University. And he's also a member of an initiative called the Good Shepherd Collective, and he's also the youngest member of our two-day conference. So we'll just put a video of 𝒔𝒕𝒉 now.
With a minor in urban studies and spatial practices, and today I'm going to talk about the question of Palestine and how it relates to Bandung and the non-aligned movement in general. And I contributed to the Ideas Network with a blog post titled Bandung and Palestine, Reviving the Past or Creating a Future, where I talk about, the shortcomings of the Bandung framework, and hopefully here I will elaborate more on my blog post and attempt to give more of context regarding the Bandung-Palestine connection and how Palestine should remain a central focus of any new Bandung framework. To start, especially in the 1950s, 1960s, the sense of emancipation of the post-colonial state finally taking history in its own hands. That feeling was very much strong in Afro-Asia and Latin America, and within that feeling of emancipation and the questions of how should we complete our emancipation, the Bandung framework, the Bandung Conference was inaugurated in 1955. And here I'm gonna repeat some of what I said in the blog post, whereby I said there are two things that were shortcomings and Achilles' heel for the Bandung framework, for the old Bandung framework. One of them is the lack of a unified vision about what imperialism is, whereby the delegates of the Bandung Conference some of them derided what they called Soviet imperialism, and others were less enthusiastic about this nomenclature and sort of trait being put on the Soviet Union at that time. So there were a lot of hot-headed discussions between the delegates surrounding this framework, and eventually, the Bandung framework took a stance that sort of, in a way, satisfied both sides and met them in the middle. The other thing is the uniformity of economic developmentalism at the time, whereby developmentalism was viewed in terms of catching up with the West instead of developing social formations that would pave the way for autocentric progress. And one of the many manifestations of this mentality is the proliferation of turnkey factories. The post-colonial state loved turnkey factories and loved packed technology, whereby they buy from multinational companies a ready-made factory, and the specialists would come and assemble it, and there's no real indigenous productive force in the process of industrialization in the post-colonial state, which puts the post-colonial state in a weird place, whereby it has a factory, it has the semblance of modernity in the sort of developmental sense, but it's always 1 step, 2 steps, 10 steps, 20 steps behind the West, if we want to, of course, put it on the metric of catching up to the West. And as I said in my blog post, developmentalism should not concern itself with catching up to the West, but more sort of trying to develop the social formations in the specific national context itself. And of course, each national context may differ from one another, so there's no ready-made formula and a universal formula for developmentalism. There are, broad frameworks you could work with, broad principles, but to universalize and to mechanize economic developmentalism, it is an erroneous mistake. In history, it doesn't exist. Each national context, each region has its own particularities, has its own material conditions that must be met. And within that, what we've seen from the post-colonial state is that uneven exchange didn't really, the industrialization didn't really change the dynamics of uneven exchange, whereby oil rent still funds a lot of the projects in the Gulf, even though, for example, the Arab Gulf countries, they're trying to stray away from oil rent. But in essence, their industries, their high-tech sectors are all funded by this oil rent, and using also foreign labor, exploitative labor too. So within that context, it's sort of a rolling snowball effect. Even if you try to break away from the system, the money you put in, if you have a wrong developmental policy, will also be as a result of the previous policy you had, which was also wrong. So in that sense, a Lebanese economist and sociologist, George Corm, analyzed developmentalism in a very critical sense, in a sense that it is very much a Eurocentric concept in its various forms. He also had critiques against Marxist developmental policies too, primarily concerning the Soviet Union specifically, and in that sense, the question here for a new Bandung framework must be, how are we going to tackle these questions? How are we going to build a framework that learns from the past instead of reviving the past for nostalgia? The world is at a critical juncture, and we must make a decision regarding how we want to conceptualize a Bandung framework. And famously, the turnkey factory model, it happened in Egypt, it happened in India, it happened in Yugoslavia, it happened in lots of places that were part and parcel of the non-aligned movement. And here we, since we're talking about Egypt, one of the most decisive blows to the non-aligned movement is precisely of how loose it is, whereby, and how status it is, whereby Egypt, where under Anwar Sadat's rule, when it, completely neglected the non-aligned movement in its after and, during its negotiations with Israel, the normalization negotiations at Camp David, and before at Ismailiyah, and even before that, after the October War, and they're trying to get settlement with Israel. After, it sort of neglected the non-aligned movement, it faded into obscurity. And, the death of the non-aligned movement was precisely because of the death of a very critical member of that movement. It couldn't sustain itself politically, and it died out. It died a very slow and very sad death in that sense. So there needs to be connections that are more organic, less statist in a new Bandung framework, whereby just because a certain country has a new policy now, it doesn't mean that country isn't within the Bandung framework and the non-aligned movement and a new non-aligned. This also, forms a protective barrier and a more organic link between the global South countries, because when we're talking about connections, we cannot put them in a status sense. Putting them in a status sense, we have tried that and we have seen the result. In the case of Egypt, it's completely neglected the non-aligned movement. Anwar Sadat famously mocked Tito, Tito very publicly at times. He mocked him. And in that sense, there's no way that one could envision a new Bandung framework without more organic connections between activists, between peoples, through programs, through more tangible things on the ground that are happening in that sense. So the focus on statism should be less than the focus on actual people-to-people connections in that sense. But also in another sense, what we've seen, and this is just an addendum to the people-to-people connections, what we've seen of Colombia, for example, in South America, the cutting diplomatic relations with Israel, and banning coal. Colombia is famously one of the top coal exporters in the world. They all started as people-to-people connections. They all start from activists who pressured the Colombian government to do this. This is also considering Gustavo Petro's, Marxist background, which played a huge part also in this. But we must also sustain this movement and sustain this momentum for Palestine through people-to-people connections that pressure governments and constantly put a strain on them whenever they try to normalize the idea, the very idea of the Zionist entity into people's minds. And in that sense, this is where, things sort of shine. When 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒔, for example, talked about Afro-Asia becoming giant. It became giant because of the social transformation that happened during that time. It became giant because of the revolutionary vigor that was at the time, that they're going to modernize and they were going to stand with the oppressed world, especially India and China. And considering, I'm also talking about the Palestinian context, whereby India was very supportive of the Palestinian cause up until the 80s and 90s. And this coincided with also the Oslo Accords. So in that sense, there's also failure on our part as Palestinians. We have regarded solidarity as being mechanical, just a given, but it requires work, it requires effort, it requires constant effort that we must sustain, lest India, for example, as of right now, becomes one of the, I think, the top one buyer of Israeli weapons in the world. We can chalk it up to the Modi regime, but if there was more pressure on the ground through making such an organic connection with the Indian people, this type of stuff would not have happened, or would have happened in a way less concentrated capacity. And the thing I'm trying to get across here is, if we want to envision a new Bandung framework, if we want to envision a new way forward, then we must look to the past, analyze our shortcomings, and build a more comprehensive framework that is less constrained by statist tendencies and more organic connections that pave the way for more long-lasting solidarities and pave the way, hopefully, for a brighter future. And if we want to stop a genocide like the one happening in Gaza, then the question, it's not an if, it's a when. Thank you so much for having me.
Our next speaker is Janvi Sen. Janvi is the deputy editor of The Wire, which is an Indian non-profit newspaper or news website. And it is known for being one of the most progressive and critical sources of journalism in India and across South Asia. And I know from speaking with some of you that it's very well known in Sri Lanka as well. So Janvi, please come in.
Thank you so much, Farwa, and thank you to all of you who are still here. I know it's been 2 days of quite a lot of intense engagement and then a very delicious lunch. So as we commemorate this anniversary of the Bandung Conference, it seems banal to say that 1955 was different from today. It would be weird if it wasn't different. But I think thinking about the ways in which it is different could help us engage more critically with the realities of today. And in some ways, perhaps the time that we're seeing today feels like it might have been more similar to 100 years ago rather than 70, when it felt like there's some sort of large upheaval in the world order that's looming, but we don't know when it's going to materialize or what it's going to look like exactly. So 1955, was a moment of excitement, of camaraderie between post-colonial states. But today, we're in a position where in these states and globally, business interests and the interests of capital have aligned more and more with each other and comprise a much larger and more powerful force. And governments in countries across the world have also drawn closer and closer ties to big business, both local and multinational. And that's something that I think, as several speakers have talked about, we can't ignore when we're talking about a new multilateral order. That domestic elites and big capital, including in the global south, and governments that are aligned with those interests may be working off of priorities that are largely different from those of the people, the environment, and an equitable future. I want to talk about all of this in the context of the industry that I work in and I know best, which is the news media. The way capital and government intersect does have serious repercussions on the media because, as we all know, most news media across the world is privately owned. Of course, you can debate whether it's possible at all for privately owned media to be entirely independent and de-link editorially from business interests, but that's not the debate I'm getting into at the moment. But what we have seen recently is that even the facade of media independence comes down when the priorities of capital and government become entirely intertwined. Now, perhaps the most stark example of this is something we saw recently in the US about a month after Donald Trump was sworn in, when Jeff Bezos announced that the Washington Post, which he owns, will no longer be publishing, will be publishing op-eds in support of free markets and personal liberties every day, and will not publish anything that stands against these so-called pillars. Now, in some ways, what Bezos has done is he's said the quiet parts out loud. We know that these things happen, but he's also exposed the ways in which owners can indeed shape editorial policy even when they have no stated or official editorial roles. And that brings me to the media in India, where I work, and which I think serves as a useful case study for what I'm trying to say. Now, while the TV media in India is largely owned by big corporates, we have newspapers that are both family-owned and also others that are owned by big corporates. This also means that a company's other business interests and the relationship they want to maintain with the government to further those other interests are reflected in how much and in what way they interfere with editorial policy. Over the last decade, we've seen the TV media become not only megaphones for the government, but often going even further than the ruling party would in terms of furthering divisive narratives and a right-wing Hindu nationalism. Now, this becomes even louder without respect for fact, nuance, or the basic tenets of journalism when it comes to matters of foreign policy. And we saw this recently during the heightened tensions between India and Pakistan. Another place that this has been evident has been during the ongoing genocide in Gaza, where unfortunately in some ways the Indian state has undone its historical pro-Palestine position. This has coincided with Indian companies selling drones and arms to Israel during its horrific military action in Palestine. India is also the largest importer of weapons from Israel. The big Indian media rarely ever covers any of this or talks about the genocide anymore. What we did see right after October 7, 2023, though, was that a large number of Indian journalists, particularly from the TV media, suddenly landed up in Israel. These are journalists who often would not go to different parts of India that are seeing conflict. But suddenly, after October 7, they were in Israel talking about how horrific October 7 was. Now, even parts of the media that do report critically on domestic matters tend to not do so or tread much more carefully when it comes to foreign policy or diplomatic matters, particularly because the discourse is highly militarized and securitized. Now, this is true not just in India and can be seen in most parts of the world, that reporting on what a government is doing domestically often looks very different from reporting on what a government is doing internationally. And what this ends up doing is limiting the scope of the conversation in some important ways. Public discourse on multilateralism and collaboration, for instance, are driven far more by the government's priorities and agenda than the people. And this is something to be challenged because in the world we live in today, while the interests of capital extend beyond borders and are even encouraged to do so, the ways in which the interests of the people extend beyond borders is paid less attention to. To build an international conversation that goes beyond what the state wants to talk about is then essential. One of the ways that we have been seeing this happen a little bit over the last few years is through cross-border investigations. This has been into financial fraud and secrecy, into military-grade surveillance technology being used against civilians, into mining companies operating in different areas. Many of these investigations have been initiated and anchored by organizations in the global north, and the potential exists to create similar collaborations housed in the global south. Much of the stories we tell and will be telling for the next several years about environmental degradation and the steps that aren't being taken to try and remedy that, about the contractualization of labor and the explosion of gig work and what that has done to the rights of workers, and about the impact of new technologies like AI exist across the world. And it makes sense to draw attention to the ways in which interests of global capital may align on these in ways that harm the interests of the people worldwide and particularly in the global south. Another way to try and do this would be to try and create and support conversations that highlight the repercussions of state policy, often supported by big capital, that go against the rights and interests of their people. A small such attempt on media freedom was made in 2023 while India was hosting the G20 summit. The independent news organization that I work for, The Wire, which Farwa also mentioned, was part of organizing a parallel M20 summit on media freedom, comprising media organizations from G20 countries and beyond. to talk about the legal, political, and financial pressures that media is coming under in countries across the world. These pressures are often common or similar, but not ones that leaders of the G20 have shown interest in discussing or addressing. Attempts like this could hold the potential of creating multilateral narratives that try and stretch and push what states are willing to say on their own. As the speakers before me, both yesterday and today, have pointed out so lucidly, to create a more just multilateral system would require global South states to truly stand as representatives of their people and their economic and social interests. I believe one of the ways to push for this is to focus on conversations that bring out those interests and the ways in which they align internationally, particularly across global South countries. Because while we may have inherited borders that are in many ways getting stricter and harsher, both physically and with the growth of ethno-nationalist movements in various parts of the world, the borders we hold in our imaginations and our conversations need only be as strong as we want them to be. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Janvi. Our next speaker is Swastika Arulingam. She is a civil and labor rights lawyer, and she is the president of the Commercial and Industrial Workers Union in Sri Lanka. Swastika has advocated for the rights of women and girls in public forums and public spheres, often highlighting the conditions of women who are vulnerable to gender-based violence. I'm glad to welcome her once again. I know she was speaking at an IDS event a few months ago on feminist economics. So welcome, Swastika.
Thank you so much for having me to speak to you today. I did not attend the conference yesterday, but I did listen to Professor Chandrasekara's speech. I want to specifically mention that because he observed that I was not there yesterday. But the specific reason I mentioned his speech is that he made a statement, and he said that if you want to build a bulwark against imperialism, it can't just be peoples. It has to be a state which represent a people who want to build this bulwark. And so after I heard this statement, this sounds like a very high ideal, and I'm just a trade unionist. So I was speaking to some of my trade union colleagues, and I said, this is a Bandung conference, and we are speaking about South-South solidarity. So what do we as trade unions have to say in this conference? And my colleague, my comrade, he simply said, there must be a lot of Sri Lankans here who also supported this government, who believe in this government. So perhaps you should say that we should start by having an honest audit about what is the government we supported to power and continue to support. And we all imagine this government to be left, both local as well as international. All of us imagine this government to be left. So you can't imagine something to exist. It has to exist. If it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. You can't imagine something. But we all imagine. My colleagues are laughing at the back also. Yes, I'm speaking about you as well. So let's have an honest audit about this government, particularly when it comes to, I'm laughing, but particularly when it comes to workers, because we are getting the first cut of what this government is doing to us. We are getting the first cut. The workers are getting the first cut, and it's not funny for us. So I thought I'll speak about the president who went on a May Day platform, and he said that this has never happened before, even in the most right-wing governments. No one criticized trade unions on May Day, but this Mr. Anurakumara Dissanayake went on stage and said, trade unions should not come and ask from us for little things. So what are these little things we were asking for at that point? We were asking for decent wages, because wages were extremely low. We are one of the lowest wage rates in Asia. We were asking for better trade union rights because workers were being dismissed for forming unions. We were asking to have safe workplaces because sexual harassment is the norm in our workplaces. So the president does not want us to speak about these things on May Day. That's what he's told us. Then we were listening to the Prime Minister who said that we have to increase productivity in Sri Lanka. in a country where, due to tariffs, factories are threatening workers from closing down and threatening unemployment. The Prime Minister is speaking about productivity, and the only time I have heard about productivity is when we sit in collective agreement discussions and the employer does not want to increase wages. So he says our productivity is very low, and therefore your wages are going to be tied to productivity, and we're not going to increase your salaries. Then we have a senior member of cabinet who says, we were asking, trade unions were asking and saying, don't send workers to Israel, because then we don't not only become complicit to the genocide, what's happening in Palestine, but we also make workers complicit in this process, because the more workers are sent to Palestine, the more it becomes harder for us to actually speak against this genocide which is happening. And he simply, went on media and said, we are not sending workers to settlement areas, we are just sending workers to Israel. And it's ironic because he is also the head or the chairman or the chairperson of the Sri Lankan Palestine Society, Friendship Society. So it's ironic that he says we are only sending workers to settlement areas when the whole state of Israel is a settlement state, it's a settler colonial state. So it was ironic to listen to him say that. Then few weeks ago, 1,400 workers were just dismissed from work, as if, just disposed of, as if there's nobody's business, international factory shut down. And we do have, despite the fact that we don't have trade union rights on the ground, we do have strong termination laws in Sri Lanka. So we thought the government would step in and, completely injunct the closure and say, you need to pay proper compensation, otherwise we are not going to allow this closure. But instead, members of the ruling party goes in parliament and blame the trade union. One of the few trade unions which exist in the free trade zone, they decide to put the blame on this trade union for the closure. And then, of course, the companies and the employers, carried on with it. So much so that the trade union leader, few days ago, he told me, we have had right-wing governments in the past, but I've never seen a government which is so captured by employers. This government is completely captured by employers. That's what he told me, and that is the reality on the ground. Then despite the fact that we don't want to stand with Palestine, when we ran out of salt, it's ironic, yes, we are a country surrounded by a sea, but we ran out of salt. Then a member of the government comes and says, no, it's because of climate change. So it's heartwarming that he's talking about climate change. And if you want to fight the climate crisis, then we need to have global solidarity. But we don't want to do that when it comes to Palestine and thousands of people being disposed of, and we don't want to stand with them. So this is the audit or the observations which we as trade unions have made of the government, because we, despite the fact that all of you know I contested in a party opposing this government, we were still hoping that there would be a space for workers to organize on the ground. There would be a space for something, at least something would change on the ground. But what we have experienced in the last 6 months is not only what we experienced under previous governments, but employers openly dismissing workers and our demands. We could actually feel that on the ground. So, since we're talking about Bandung and we are talking about the spirit of Bandung and South-South solidarity, and we want to build this bulwark against imperialism, I want to start from ground. I want to start from here. I want to start from Sri Lanka, because we are addressing this issue here, and say that workers are starting to build something despite the odds against us. We are starting to put the building blocks back on the ground. We are starting from ground zero, because our workers' movement was destroyed. In the 1980s with the general strike, there was a big destruction of unions, and since then we have been struggling. But once again, things are reviving on the ground despite the odds against us. What we do not have, however, is intellectuals and academics who call yourselves left, to stand with workers, to not stand with the government, or not stand with the state, and to excuse everything which is happening, to imagine that this government is left when it is not, when it is captured by the local elite, but to stand with workers, to stand with farmers, to stand with fishers, to build cooperatives, to actually do this. And we don't have to excuse this government in order to do that, because despite whatever this government has done, this government only exists because of the spirit of the Aragaliyar. That is the only reason this government exists. So we also believe in that. We also believe in that spirit, the spirit which people wanted system change. They came together. They pushed out the old elites. Unfortunately, new elites were hoisted again. But we believe in that spirit, and that is precisely why, despite the odds, trade unions are working towards organizing workers, farmers, and so on. And we are working towards specific goals. We have asked for debt justice. We have asked for exit IMF. I'm told by some people that exit IMF is a far-right slogan, far-left slogan, whatever that means. I didn't know there was something called far-left, but I'm told. So we are still calling for exit IMF and exit from IMF conditionalities. We are asking for debt justice. We are asking for, I won't say debt forgiveness because there's nothing to forgive, as someone said the other day. We are asking for a new debt renegotiation. We are asking the government, we are demanding the government to reopen it. And we are not doing this alone because we know that debt is not a Sri Lankan problem. And we speak about South-South solidarity, but we know if you want to start off with South-South solidarity, start with debt, start with climate issues, start with what IMF is doing. As we stand here speaking, the NPP government has put forward a bill to unbundle the Ceylon Electricity Board. While it has failed in all other countries, we all know unbundling the energy source is the first step towards privatization. It has failed in so many other countries. And now they are talking about bringing back into the public ownership. But here we are talking about unbundling the Ceylon Electricity Board. So let's talk about these things. Let's talk about the IMF. Let's talk about debt justice. Let's talk about climate. These are things which we can actually build South-South solidarity, because these are concrete. These are not issues floating in the sky. These are concrete issues. And these are issues I think workers and farmers and workers' movements and farmers' movements and fishers' movements can actually come together to talk about these things and can actually build pressure to change governments. Because if we are going to rely on governments, if we are going to rely on this government, we're going to rely on, no one is relying on the Modi government, but in case someone is, change is not going to, we can just, keep talking about it. During Bandung, maybe the situation, not maybe, of course the situation was different. There was a euphoria because countries were coming out, new countries were being born, independent movements. We have just won independent struggles, but that doesn't exist now. So where do we find that hope? We find that hope in what's happening on the ground. So when I say South-South solidarity, I don't just mean ideas floating in the sky. I actually mean movements connecting. And we're already doing that. We are not waiting for academics or intellectuals to lead us. We're already doing that. But what we do need, however, is knowledge and data and things which in the past academics and intellectuals did contribute towards, and now they have, for whatever reason, have slowed down or completely stopped working with us. So that's what we need, and that is what I would like to ask in this conference, which has many of you here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Swastika. That was a very useful, informative, and a call to sort of on the ground for academics and activists alike. So our next speaker is 𝒔𝒆𝒂𝒓𝒔 𝑨𝒐𝒖𝒕𝒉. She. Okay. Oh, okay, sorry. So our next speaker is 𝒔𝒆𝒂𝒓𝒔 𝑨𝒐𝒖𝒕𝒉. She is the co-director of Progressive International, an international political organization that works to unite, organize, and mobilize the world's progressive forces. 𝒔𝒆𝒂𝒓𝒔 is also the acting chair of the Hague Group, a new organization from the Global South aiming to hold Israel accountable for its actions in Gaza. So, 𝒔𝒆𝒂𝒓𝒔, welcome.
This is a losing fight, me versus podiums at every stage. Thanks everyone for inviting me here. Thank you, Farwa, for giving me this platform. The banding spirit that we're discussing today feels a little bit like the mood of this room right now, where the grand opening happened long ago and we're all a bit sleepy and unsure about where the spirit lies. But I hope that I can keep your attention in this last remarks of the day. I know that when we look back 70 years ago and talk about the bandung spirit, we're really talking about the Global South rebelling, right? Rebelling against the outright horrors of colonialism of eras past. And now, 70 years later, when we look at it, we're talking about a different kind of rebellion. Can the people of the Global South, the same states of the Global South, now rebel against a more insidious danger, an insidious danger of the consolidation of transnational capital and empire that we see really has spread across the world? And I feel like the question we've been grappling with throughout these 2 days is, can the South rebel? What would it take? What would that look like? And I want to start from a slightly different question, which is, what does happen when the South rebels? What does happen when small states in the Global South do attempt to resist this kind of global international order? And I actually want to borrow from my speakers on this panel today and tell you maybe very briefly 3 stories from 3 parts of the world. Tegucigalpa in Honduras, Harare in Zimbabwe, and return to The Hague. If you go to Harare today, which Freedom talked about in his speech, you'll see a country and an economy that's been completely wrecked by sanctions. Something that isn't even reported in the media. When we think of sanctions, we think of Iran, we think of Cuba, we think of Venezuela. Rarely is it that we actually think of Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe has been under over 2 decades of sanctions from both the United States, from the European Union. And if you ask why this happened, it's because when it had its colonial independence movement, and it was still Rhodesia under British colonial rule, Zimbabweans decided they wanted to take their land back. And under what conditions? When it was Rhodesia, 80% of the land, of the native arable land, was saved just for the white settler colonial farmers. And they created these legal reserves, right, called the native reserves. And it was the only non-arable 20% of land where black natives could actually own the land and do their farming. So naturally, when you had an independence movement, as Freedom obviously laid out, land was central to that question. Taking back land was, of course, central to the very creation of Zimbabwe. But what happens is instantly, of course, when the land reform actually kicks in, you have, boom, sanctions from the United States, sanctions from the EU, and you have domestic laws in the United States, that something called the ZEDERA law, by the way, specifically about Zimbabwe, which mandates every single United States employee in the IMF, in the World Bank, in any international financial institution, by law, to veto any funding to the Zimbabwean government. All this because Zimbabwe decided to try and take its land back. But that's not even the horrific part of the story. If you go to Harare today, you will see that Zimbabweans are paying their former white colonizer, former colonizer families money as reparations for taking the land back. $3.5 billion in what's called the compensation deal, which of course the current government has now capitulated to in 2020, only to get rid of this boot of the sanctions that stays on their neck. If you're in progressive rooms in the global north in the US in academic forums, there's almost this sense of, we're entering this new era and, we're talking about reparations and artifacts are being sent back to the global south. But if you go to places like Zimbabwe, you realize that's bullshit. Forget reparations. What we're really living in is an era of reverse reparations, right? Where the Zimbabwean government now is forced to go to the African Development Bank to take a loan for money it does not have and give $3.5 billion to pay its former colonizers for land that it rightfully took back. This isn't a story that's unique to Zimbabwe. You go to Honduras, you see once again a country that's being bankrupted. This time by crypto billionaires from California. Billionaires who are heads of organizations like PayPal, Palantir, Peter Thiel, the famous guy who said, the age of government is dead because he believes that billionaires should now run the world. And that's exactly what they did in Honduras. With the support of a US military coup-led government, they instituted charter cities and set up these special economic zones, went to a beautiful island called Roatan, took it over, and said, we're going to build a micro-nation and a libertarian paradise here. What does a libertarian paradise mean? Literally exactly what it sounds like. So they wanted Bitcoin to be the official currency of this island. They wanted voting to be proportionate to the amount of property that you own. And of course, when the local community protested, they shut off the water supplies, shut off the electricity, and said, no, actually, this is a special economic zone and a charter city that belongs entirely to us. Again, history, of course, moves, and you have new socialist movements. And Honduras does have its own new socialist government, elects its first woman president, whose first campaign promise is, if I get elected, I'm going to abolish the Z days law, in Spanish, what's the SCZs as we call it in this part of the world, and take our own land back. And she does exactly that, wins the election, and through a unanimous vote in the parliament, abolishes the special economic zones law and says this island actually belongs to us. What happens then? Boom, again, punishment. They are hit with 10 lawsuits from 10 different companies in secret corporate tribunals in Washington, D.C., because all of them have clauses, the investor-state dispute settlement clause, that's part of every single bilateral investment treaty that the Global South has with companies in the Global North. One lawsuit alone is $10.8 billion. And if you want to kind of make sense of this number, it's 2/3 of the annual national budget of a country like Honduras and 1/3 of its GDP, essentially pushing the country into complete bankruptcy. Every stage of the game, wherever you see the Global South trying to take its own land back, as is the case with Zimbabwe, trying to take its own trade back, as is the case with Honduras, you see that punishment comes down swiftly and certainly from the Global North. And I want to end with The Hague, where I had the great privilege of being inside the Peace Palace with the delegation from South Africa at the start of last year, bringing the historic Genocide Convention case against Israel. And this is yet again another moment, right, where the Global South was taking our global institutions back. The ICJ, if any of you have seen pictures, when you go into this, it's called the Great Hall. It's actually not very great at all. It's quite tiny. But it has these beautiful kind of stained glass windows all around. And I was looking at them and asked somebody, what's on these stained glass windows? Turns out it's $1 million donation from Andrew Carnegie, so on and so forth. And it's supposed to depict this evolution of progress, where Western civilization, who were the enlightened in these stained glass windows, were bringing the ideas of progress to the rest of the world that was stuck in primitivity still on these stained glass windows inside the ICJ. And that's really actually the origins of these institutions, right? ICC famously was always called the black man's court because it had never dared to actually bring any Western criminals into the court until, of course, they tried to go after Bush, and now they're trying to go after Netanyahu. So certainly puzzling for me inside the Great Hall of the ICJ, because I, as an Indian, could certainly not see myself in this evolution of progress stained glass windows. Neither could my South African comrades. Neither could actually the Irish lawyers who were part of the South African delegation. But what happens after this case? We come out of the hall, and Netanyahu goes on television and says, "Nothing can stop us. Nobody can stop us. Not even The Hague." And immediately, 2 weeks after that, in the US House of Representatives, a bill is introduced to put all United States bilateral relations with South Africa under review. Once again, the logic of punishment. Every time Global South tries to take its own institutions, own land, own trade back, the logic of unilateral punishment from the powerful nations of the world is certainly something that we observe. Now, what do you do when you have unilateral punishment? And this is where I'd like to kind of make the argument for why I'm, I suppose, a bit more optimistic, because I don't think there is any other option. The only antidote to unilateral punishment is collective action from the Global South. With or without ideological coherence, which is something that we can debate until the cows come home, of course, for the Global South. And this is what we've seen at the start of this year with what's called the Hague Group of Nations, which is 8 countries: Malaysia, South Africa, Namibia, Senegal, Colombia, Cuba, Bolivia, Honduras, who all came together and announced something very simple, that we, just learning from how we defeated the South African apartheid regime, are going to replicate a collective bloc once again to institute coordinated measures against Israel's violations of international law. We will arrest Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant should they come onto any of our soils. We will not let our ports give harbor to any ships that want to carry military equipment to Israel, and we will not let our factories be used to export arms to Israel. So simply saying we will use our courts, our ports, and our factories to materially cut off the arteries of the genocidal machine in Israel. But this idea of collective action isn't limited to geopolitics, right? You do see that in political economy as well. Why do I say that? The same ISDS logic, Honduras, when it's hit with this lawsuit, does withdraw entirely from what's called the ICSID, the court, the secret court in Washington, D.C., that arbitrates all of these debates, right? But Honduras doing it alone means that, of course, the United States ambassador in Tegucigalpa is making lots of noises. There's articles every day in the Wall Street Journal, in Washington Post, in the FT about investor confidence completely dropping. Their credit ratings have gone down. But if you do it collectively, it's very hard for an entire region's credit ratings to be slashed in one go. Why do I think this is possible? Because the Europeans have done exactly just this. 6 months ago, the European Union collectively decided to exit what's called the Energy Charter Treaty because it has the ISDS clause, and when they were trying to stop drilling, they were being sued by fossil fuel companies. Italy was sued by a fossil fuel company, Spain was being fined by a fossil fuel company, and so collectively they decided, let's all withdraw, instead of each of us doing it alone, because they look at Honduras and they know when you do it alone, the companies in transnational capital are going to come for you. And the same model is being experimented with, let me say more cautiously, by Global South nations. I'm coming from a meeting at CELAC 2 months ago where there were 20 nations of Latin America and the Caribbean sitting collectively to discuss how they might put all of their bilateral investment treaties under review at the same time. And these are countries that stretch from Cuba to Panama, right? So there's really no kind of left spectrum that I'm talking about. But if I can kind of borrow liberal speak, it just makes common sense. It makes good sense for small global south countries to act together. And this idea of collective withdrawal, something that Ndongo talked about, that's evident in Bruno's speech, for example, you can see multiple other things. A patent cooperation treaty. What does it do? It's a treaty that allows a company to just file a patent in one country and have it automatically apply in every other country that's party to the treaty. If I withdraw, I'm making it that much harder for a Pfizer or a Moderna or an AstraZeneca to immediately apply its patent in my country. And I'm saying, no, actually, you have to follow my government's rules and my sovereign health framework. And this idea of collective kind of bargaining applies on multiple levels, and it has been experimented with. COVID is a very good example of the moment, which I know many of us want to forget, but a moment where our international institutions failed us, right? Our global public health institutions. Turns out they weren't really global, and they weren't really about public health either. We tried to work with the World Health Organization to say, let's pool all our vaccine patent technologies together. Anyone discovers a vaccine, let's all produce it. It died because Global North opposed it. Then we went to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and we said, fine, it's not a patent pool, that's too radical, it's scaring people off. It's just a temporary waiver, right? Just for the duration of the pandemic, let's not apply patent protections onto vaccine technologies. That died as well, despite the support of 100 nations from the Global South, because the EU and the United States, countries where the pharma companies are headquartered, vehemently vetoed it all the way to the end. But you had a new bloc. You had a bloc that was led by Cuba, which offered its vaccine technology without patent, taken up by Mexico and Argentina before Milei, who offered their production capacities, also taken up by countries like Bolivia, Kerala government in India, Kisumu County in Kenya, saying, yeah, we'd actually like to produce for the South from the South. Why on earth should developing countries be reduced to this position where arms outstretched, we're begging either for pharma companies to find a conscience or for global north governments to give us their charity? We actually will set up our own health sovereign bloc. And these are, again, experiments that are real, that are out there in the world, that have been worked with, right? These are not theoretical ideas that we're trying to imagine into existence, as my previous speaker said. But the only way to lock these victories is to institutionalize them. When you had something like the UNASUR, the regional South American regional organizations, they had a very simple idea. They created what's called a medicine price bank, for example. Sounds silly. What is it? Right now, no country is allowed to reveal what price a pharma company is offering them for a medicine. By law, by the contract, it's written in opacity deals, right? That you cannot tell your neighboring country. I, as India, can't tell Bangladesh, hey, I've been offered $6 per dose for this vaccine. Bangladesh can't tell Sri Lanka, essentially allowing us to not work together. They said, fuck this. We're going to have, we're going to have a bank where we all simply list the prices that were being offered so that we as a region are going to collectively negotiate. and get a price that's fair, so they do not let us divide and rule and essentially create what's a race to the bottom. And that applies across the board, right? It applies to wage rate, it applies to product rates. And again, why do we know this works? Because the Global North does it. They've just set up a critical minerals club. The EU and the United States have signed a deal to buy critical minerals from our countries together because they want to negotiate for the lowest prices and the worst deals with us, so we don't have any negotiating power where we say, oh, US, we don't want to go to you, we're going to go to France instead. When they do it, they call it a club. If we were to set up a critical minerals producers organization, it would, of course, be called a cartel. Whatever it's called, the logic remains, it is workable and it is doable, and these experiments are something that we should watch and absolutely support in person. I think I'm definitely over time, so the last thing I wanted to say perhaps is, I'm not, I am a statist, I think, in my optimism, but it's certainly not limited to states. I think this kind of experimentation of what does internationalism really look like in the 21st century begs each of us, movements, trade unions, intellectuals, to rethink our own activities. The idea of the strike, what do workers have at their disposal? The ability to withdraw their labor. That's been completely decimated by the new age transnational capital company like Amazon, right? What happens when workers in an Amazon factory go on strike? First of all, there's no manager. If it's an Uber or a food delivery app, there's not even an office to get out. In an Amazon warehouse, if you go on strike, it simply leaves the city because it's so hyper-powerful, hyper-mobile. It can move from Delhi to Bombay, leave India altogether, go to another country, to whichever suitable atmosphere it finds without ever having to negotiate with its workers. So how do you use a strike to make the machine halt in the workplace? Do a transnational strike. Again, not a radical idea, but one of the experiments that we've been engaged with is a transnational strike on Black Friday in 200 Amazon warehouses across 45 countries at the same time to finally make the machine halt and actually make Amazon negotiate with us. Because Jeff Bezos tried to buy this out by offering a bonus. It didn't work. And in fact, some workers showed up right in front of his $1 million home in Washington, D.C. and decided to put a projection onto that about how he was a genocide billionaire. But that aside, there is something special about experimenting with this kind of new age transnational strike, and the same applies, of course, to many other ideas, including the ones that Janvi touched upon with the media. My mother, and I'll end on this story because I feel like I've told too many stories. My mom, who doesn't speak English, she comes from a small village, she's a daughter of a farmer, and only speaks Telugu, which is my native tongue, but still brought me up with stories of Ayande and speeches of Ho Chi Minh, and I never quite realized where the hell did she read these things, right? How did she get them? And now, I know that I personally struggle. I'm in Sri Lanka today, and I have requests from a few friends who are sitting in Tunisia and New York telling me, can you please get this book? It's only available in Sri Lanka. I can't order it anywhere else, right? Memoirs of one of your great leaders. And it made me realize it was the Soviet press, which translated at the time into nearly 36 Indian languages, literature and speeches from across the third world, from across the East, into pamphlets and affordable booklets for Indians, for people like my mom to consume. We're missing that. And this is not, again, a question of radical ideas and something that's amazing. It's actually a question of simple translations infrastructure. Again, an experiment that we at the Progressive International are engaged with amazing partners like The Wire, for example, where we want not just headlines, but critical analysis from around the world through a very simple network of independent left media publications. But what we can bring to the table is, through people like you, a giant translations infrastructure where everything that we're talking about can start in Hindi and Telugu and Tamil or Sinhala, but then reaches parts of the world and left forces across the world in French and Portuguese and German and Brazilian and so on and so forth. So I guess in conclusion, really what I'd like to say is, from taking over the streets to seizing the state, I really want us to be thinking about what it means to build Southern institutions very much in the same spirit of the new international economic order, and I guess ask the question, which is our motto when we set up our international: how do we make solidarity more than a slogan? Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Varsha. Thanks for ending on this powerful note. And now we open the floor for questions. So we had a series of interventions starting from agrarian reform to Pan-Africanism. We then heard about the importance of Palestine and the Middle East and the necessity of it in any new Bandung formation. And then we moved towards the role of media, a very broad sketch of what's happening in the US as well as in India. And we then moved to what's happening in Sri Lanka, the importance of trade unionism and the need for academics and intellectuals to support these movements. And finally, we ended with a new multilateral initiative or experiments which are necessary at this moment on every level to unite. So please raise your hand for questions and somebody will pass the mic. We have a hand here.
Hi, I'm 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒔 𝑨𝒇𝒕𝒅𝒂𝒓, an undergraduate of International Relations and Law. So my question is directed to Ms. Varsha. In your speech, which was a stark presentation on the inequalities that we face at the Global South, you mentioned one case study, the ICJ ruling with the filing of South Africa against Israel. So my question to you is the collective action from the Global South is naive to be held optimistic that it will work? Is it naive to be accept that the collective action will actually work while the actual enforcement is lacking? For example, when the ICJ ruled that Israel is committing acts of genocide, there's nothing happening in the world right now to sanction them or not. But what happened actually was US sanctioned the ICJ, and the Western countries are now leaving ICC, for example, Hungary, and no Western country has yet tried to arrest Netanyahu when he has an open warrant issued by ICC. So do you think it is naive to believe that collective action will work or while the enforcement is lacking? Thank you.
Oh, come on. You can't ask that question to one activist. Here, please, yeah. The mic here. And then there was a hand there? Okay.
Actually, I was not going to speak at all. I was listening to so many speakers in the last 4 sessions for the last 2 days. But you finally kind of forced me or coerced me to speak. This is because I have this feeling, maybe perhaps something to do with my age, of being pessimistic, having lived through, seen what's been going on and being aware of things from the 1960s onwards, that this whole spirit of Bandung, non-aligned movement at its peak, liberation movements in Africa and different parts of the world, and we reached a particular crescendo of South strengthening. But I'm going to say something a bit heretical probably. Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the breakup of that balance in the Cold War, that maintained a certain level of social justice around the world because there was a balance. And with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the single superpower, and from the 1990s onwards till today, what we are seeing is the work of a single superpower strengthened by no competition, nothing to fight it. And we are scattered, our strengths are scattered, we are fighting in different situations, all by ourselves in small little niches. And I'm glad that there are young people like you who still want to fight on. For me, gives a little hope, because I, for myself, had no hope really that things are going to be different. because the things were going from bad to worse. True, the whole American hegemony is at its sunset. But what is the future that holds for this so-called South-South solidarity? That's a question that I will ask any one of you to try and respond so that we can have some hope for the future.
Hello, I'm Dahanayaka from Sri Lanka. I must say that I was impressed. The speech given finally by a young lady impressing us to take action. We can discuss, we can listen, but we have to take action against the hegemony of the dictatorship of the capital and for new economic order for the world. So my question is whether do you have any idea of action plan? That is my question.
I have a provocative question for Freedom, because I read your blog piece, and also today you said that Lagos Action Plan was a kind of a progressive economic blueprint. I would like to know what is the basis of that point of view, because I would myself argue that there have been interesting rhetorical elements in the Lagos Action Plan, but there were a number of theoretical weaknesses, political weaknesses that explain that, you know, somehow it was never implemented because we had the World Bank report, and because basically most of the financing of the Lagos Action Plan was expected, you know, from, let's say, the international financial community, basically. So why would you think that this was something really transformative? And I have the feeling also that since then, most of the so-called economic blueprints coming from the continent have become, to some extent, worse in terms of, you know, ambitions of economic transformation. And I'm wondering whether we have not been, you know, to some extent cheated as progressives, because sometimes you have African collective efforts done by African people, but in fact the mindset generally is not progressive at all. We had the NEPAD and we have the IFCFTA, and myself, I would not see them as Pan-Africanists. So should we not also be a bit critical about all these documents that pretend to be Pan-Africanist?
Okay, we have one more question and then we open up the...
Mine is more of a comment and to emphasize a key message that I heard during these 2 days of the conference, which is the centrality of Palestine in our anti-imperialist struggles and struggle for liberation. I'm really happy that all speakers centered Palestine in the last 2 days, because it is really important to see Palestine liberation not simply as a moral issue, not simply as a human rights issue, but fundamentally as a struggle against US-led imperialism and against global fossil capitalism. Because US hegemony in the region relies on two key pillars. Israel as a Euro-American settler colony, which is a kind of an advanced imperial outpost safeguarding the geo-economic and geopolitical interests of the United States-led bloc. But also the second bloc is the reactionary, oil-rich Gulf monarchies that make the Middle East one of the key nodal points of global fossil capitalism in the world. So when we have that political economy analysis, Palestine liberation becomes a struggle against US-led imperialism, against, you know, the survival of humanity and the planet.
the mics with you. Well, anybody can start.
So starting with your first question, I am optimistic, and I don't think I'm naive. Or if I am, then I'm happy to be naive and optimistic, I suppose. It is very difficult to be super optimistic about our institutions, right, and collective action within existing multilateral institutions because they are so rigged against us. A British person's vote is worth nearly 40 times what a Nigerian person's vote would be at the IMF. The UN always has a Security Council without which the General Assembly decisions aren't binding, where the US exerts its veto. So, of course, there's many reasons to be incredibly pessimistic about this. But look at history. If you look at what actually made the South African apartheid regime fall, it did build exactly in these forms. It begins actually with the first conference that brings together the national liberation movements across the African continent to say our liberation is not complete unless Palestinians are free. It moves from there to the World Conference Against Apartheid in Geneva, where actually and you get the arms embargo in the United Nations Security Council, where again some of the biggest champions were actually the Scandinavian countries. And then even later, 10 years later, it ends up in Delhi with the much larger World Conference for the defeat of South African apartheid, I think it's called, which builds a big global alliance where national level policies are enforced in order to once again cut off the regime, right? Finally, with a final straw against the back, and includes trade sanctions, so on and so forth. But I do think, historical changes do build in these forms. But in the specific ICJ case and Israel's case, of course, it's disappointing to look at the ICJ decision and say this is not binding, no one's enforcing it. But that's exactly why I think that the Hague Group of Nations are so promising, right? Because what they're doing is saying, we're not waiting around for a UN Security Council. We're not waiting around for the European nations to come around. We, at this moment, are going to cut off the arteries. And it is concrete in the sense that it creates a no-go map for Netanyahu, which really does affect them. It also creates a no-go map for Israeli soldiers. There's very few things that Netanyahu is scared about. But the minute that cases started to come against Israeli soldiers who've been, they love traveling, they've been showing up in Sri Lanka, of course, one of their big favorite destinations, but in Costa Rica and Brazil and everywhere they've gone when there's been cases against him, he issued an ordinance to the army to stop recording themselves doing all of these heinous things and actually recording footage of them committing war crimes, because that's what was being used to create those cases, right? So they are scared of these kind of concrete measures. The energy embargo from Colombia is critical because Colombia was one of the biggest exporters of coal to Israel, for example. And this is exactly the kind of economic might that does underpin the political settler colonial project. And I think cutting that off is not enough, not nowhere near enough, but I do believe it's exactly the right direction of collective action that we're looking at. I'll maybe quickly answer some of the others that came my way. I don't know quite how to answer the pessimism question. I do think that there is evidence of South-South solidarity. I don't want to overstate it and really be a propagandist, which I sometimes can, because we're not living in a world where there are communist states around the globe that have a vision and a real vision for the future. But one thing I'll say is, even though it does feel like history moves in cycles and we're kind of just seeing transformations of global capitalism that finds a new way of setting up the same regime of extraction and accumulation, right? Extraction from the periphery and accumulation of the core, it is hitting an organic limit, which is climate change, where extraction cannot continue at the rate that it is, even for the North. So that same cycle and that same dialectic, I don't think can continue now, because you're seeing the effects of essentially us destroying our planet in the cities. They're not the front lines, but you are already seeing the effects of that in the global North as well, which again is illustrated by the fact that for the first time in history, they're abandoning fossil fuel companies, right? All of Europe is abandoning fossil fuel companies together and saying, actually, we're going to take back power. So I think there's something changing there, which might be a greater rupture than just a transformation where the same cycle gets set up once again. This is going to be an advertisement for my job, which I will say shamelessly anyway. We actually do have a project called the New International Economic Order, which many in this room are involved with. It's incredible third world scholars from around the world, and many more, I'm sure, who can be involved, including political leaders, governments who've actually experimented with kicking out military bases, setting up things like the Medicine Price Bank, setting up regional organizations and building things like... Regionalization is exciting, right? Because it's not just about political economy gains, it's also about social changes. Traditionally, infrastructure always went from plantation to port everywhere, because that's how the colonial infrastructure went. They didn't care about building a train between your city and my city so that we could both feel part of a national identity together. They just built from your city to the port, my city to the port, so that it can be extracted straight to the port. But there have been regional cultural organizations and infrastructure organizations that have also made these kind of changes. So all of that expertise is actually being brought together now, we're hoping. And we have what's we inside the organization call a manual for mutiny, but outside it's just called NIO, Program of Action, to give it a slightly more academic-y name. But you can download it on the website, and it's a living document that we're hoping to work with that doesn't just live as an academic space, but is working with these different progressive governments in power to put in some of these ideas as experiments. One such project is very similar to the COVID idea we just talked about, but in South Africa now, because of USAID cut to HIV funding, where in this moment where Trump has just decided, I'm not going to give money for HIV funding anymore, South Africa has two options, and actually all of the African continent has two options. Find yet another country that would be a donor and give them funding, or set up a health sovereignty project where they actually invest in HIV retroviral biotechnology. And who are they looking to for that? They're looking to Cuba, which is an incredibly exciting southern project because Cuba has some of the most advanced biotechnology in the world. And if it could spread across the continent, you'll see some gains that would last over centuries. So I think there's quite a few experiments like that in this action plan, as you kind of called it, but you can also see it on our website. That's it for me.
I guess I'll start by just responding to what Hamza said, and I completely agree. And I think one of the big disappointments in global South solidarity over the last few years has been the fact that governments have not come together on this. The Hague Group is an incredible endeavor, and it's wonderful that those countries did, and South Africa's action particularly was inspiring. But, I mean, coming from a country that was one of the first to recognize the Palestinian state and then seeing the reaction today has been, incredibly disappointing. And I do think that now the only way forward would be pressure from the people, because the states from the global south that one would think this would be the obvious choice to come together on as post-colonial states have not done that. But you're right, I agree. It's nice that so many of the speakers have centered that in what they've said. I guess I'll also respond to what you said, sir, about hope and when you lost it. And I think Varsha and I both, and I'm sure many others in this room, were born after the fall of the Soviet Union. And and so we don't have that moment or the moment before that to maybe hang on to as a time when things were better. And I think in that situation, hope and the fight is a political choice. It's not a belief necessarily. And I guess that's what keeps it going.
I wasn't planning to respond, but I just wanted to respond to this comment. As Sri Lankans, we did have a moment in 2022, and I'm going to hold on to that, despite the fact that things have not, things have gone south since then. But just to respond to the Palestinian question, I think what brought down the apartheid in South Africa is ultimately economic sanctions, and like even South Africa, right? They are taking Israel to court, but then they are also they're not cutting trade, they're not cutting economic ties with Israel. And that is precisely what our government is also saying. So I think it's not enough to, legal sanctions are very important, I think it's really important, but if you want to bring down an genocidal state, an apartheid state, economic sanctions, at this point, economic sanctions are, I think, must. And that is what I think as people we should push for. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will respond to Ndongo Sila. Yeah, the Lagos plan of action. Why I think or suggest that it is something that we should revisit. Mainly, why I say so, because when you look at the document, its analysis of the causes of the problems or development challenges in Africa, it noted quite well that we had dependent development arising from, from deteriorating terms of trade and many other things, and it went on to propose issues such as industrialization, right? Also intra-African trade, right? Those were some of the suggestions which I think were very positive. Added to that, the development model, in my view, which is suggested in the Lagos Plan of Action, was state-centered, right? In other words, I mean that the development realized that, the African states then realized that capital was supposed to play a subservient role. So state planning was going to be the key. I agree with you that on the issue of finance, reliance on external actors is not something quite positive. Yes, I agree. And this is one thing which is not, which I think also we must not be followed. And also, I also concur that other initiatives such as NEPAD, if you look at other initiatives such as NEPAD, they have tended to be, they are neoliberal in outlook, right? That's one of the, if you look at NEPAD and compare it with the Lagos Plan of Action, you realize that the former Lagos Plan of Action was far much better. So we still can get much more from that document. I'm not saying that we should adopt it as it is, but we have some positive issues that were identified by the African leaders then in 1980, which we can still implement today. Thank you.
So we have half an hour, and we can take one more round of questions if you have any. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all presentations, and my question goes to Varsha, because you raised a point which was interesting for me. When we think about Latin America and the possibilities for Latin American integration, there are several obstacles for that. But in my opinion, one of that is that we have a very radical political twist in the region, which is the case in many parts of the world, but in Latin America maybe it's stronger now, with Correa, Lenin Moreno, and then in Argentina, in Brazil, Lula, Bolsonaro. So obviously it creates problems for regional integration. And then I was positively surprised by listening that finally you are managing to do something regardless of the ideology. So my question is, from the practical experience that you are having, to what extent do you think that this political twist is a problem or can be circumvented if you think on the regional integration, regional cooperation, but also the global cooperation of the Global South? And it comes back to Bandung as well, because in Bandung we also had these divergences.
So somebody in the back, yeah.
I've been sitting here yesterday and today. I've been observing and listening the discussions, and I think the context of South significantly changed from 55's Bandung conference. So the role of India and China, I see that it is overlooked, particularly given that the agenda of expansionism, Tibet, Taiwan, in the case of Kashmir. I think I would like to hear from any of the speakers about that.
Thank you. We have one, we can take one more question. Okay. Actually, you asked a question before. Is there somebody who hasn't asked a question? I know him, so that's why I can be like that. Okay. So because of the deafening silence, I have to give the floor back to you.
All right. I have a question directed mainly towards SWAS. Few people mentioned the Soviet Union, so a quick, very interesting anecdote is, during World War II, the workers in Sri Lanka, organized by the communists, got really riled up about solidarity with the Soviet Union. They really believed in it. And there was a story that one of the workers was dismissed in a factory for organizing a union. And at the time, they were finishing an order for the Soviet Union, and he refused to leave the factory. And the factory owner said, "We're not going to pay you." And the worker said, "It's okay, I'll work for free for the Soviet Union." Very different time. Cannot imagine that today. You talked about, I think, very important things about practical things that intellectuals can do for the workers and peasants movements in countries like Sri Lanka. And historically, one of the things that we can do as intellectuals is to provide workers with political knowledge, to arm them with knowledge that they would otherwise not have. And, in the current context of all the changes happening in the world, like it's been nice to see a revival of, say, pro-Palestine activism, but it always feels like in Sri Lanka we're still very inward-looking, like a kind of a frog in a well mentality, right? We don't have many conversations at the level of working-class organizations of the processes happening around the world. Not just Palestine, but also the Sahel, Venezuela, could be about, processes happening in China, for example, and so on. So, like, what can we do concretely to have those conversations? Or is it just that since the 80s, the working class movement has been destroyed to such a point that, it's still bread and butter issues, it's still, talking about the next collective bargaining contract and so on?
Yeah, thanks for your question. We'll go this way, and please be brief. And also, you can have some concluding remarks.
No, myself, I don't have it.
I think we still have discussions about geopolitical issues. It's just that it happens at a level of trade union leaders rather than workers. And I think one of the reasons for that is, unlike perhaps in the 1980s or before that, we don't have large unions. In fact, our unionization rate is so low. So we are, as I said, we are now only starting to build unions again. What we have is remnants of what we had before, right? It's very small unions and workers. So when we are starting to build unions, we can't, for instance, just to think of, let's say, discussions we have on the ground. We have to deal with bread and butter issues if we want to win the trust of, particularly of blue-collar workers. Because any kind of action which comes on the ground does not come from office workers. It comes from blue-collar workers. Even within our union, we can see that, the difference between different classes of workers. So perhaps that's why we don't have these discussions. But I think very, very slowly things are changing on the ground. And interestingly, it started with the tariff issue. Because the tariff issue actually affects the bread and butter of our workers. If factories close down, if they lose job, then there is no plan B. Workers have come into the free trade zone, they have to work. Some of them have thought, we're going to work in this factory till we retire. So tariff issue is the one which actually changed workers' curiosity towards what's happening internationally. It was not brands, it was not anything else, it was tariff. On the Palestine question, interestingly, since the tariff issue, I don't know what the correlation is, but since the tariff issue, our membership has been interested in what's happening globally, not only on the economic question, but also on politics. When India and Pakistan went to war, there was a vibrant debate around it, and we had discussions about it and so on. So things are, I think, changing. But whatever discussion we have on the ground, because we are starting from ground zero, have to start from bread and butter issues, and that's what we are doing. And that is because we do that, when we speak about tariff, when we speak about Palestine, when we speak about what's happening in South Asia, workers are listening to us. And that is what I think we will continue to do. Still it's in early stages, so it's hard to say. But I think things are moving. Thank you.
Yeah, Bruno's question about, Latin America is famously kind of I don't think I fully agree with the pendulum theory, but the theory goes, it swings between far right and far left governments often. And what does that mean for regional integration projects? Ndongo and I were having this conversation earlier about how when you're on the left, sometimes you have to be conservative. You have to be conservative about your progressive wins. What do we mean by that? That when we do actually get a victory, we have to be able to lock it in place, right? And before I start talking about integration, at the national level, so something like exiting this transnational corporation arbitration clause, which Ecuador, for example, when it did have a left government under the government of Rafael Correa, a small country, right, in South America, and now doesn't have a left government anymore, was cool. Long story short, there's a banana plantation business owner that's currently the president, voted in just a few weeks ago. But when the question of an ISDS clause, really boring, technocratic, something that's, in the dark halls of the Ministry of Trade that's often discussed, was brought out into the public as, and some of what you're describing, Swastika, which is that bread and butter issues aren't isolated from the global economy, right? But to be even building that narrative is a political project in and of itself, where the government and the people and the unions do have to work together. And that project was such a mass popular project that this clause, that we will not have this clause in our bilateral investment treaties, went into the new Ecuadorian constitution, such that it was locked in that we as the Ecuadorian people will never subject ourselves, will never make ourselves vulnerable to lawsuits from transnational companies that will sue our governments when we institute pro-poor policies. So when the left government was was couped, and it did lose power, and a new right-wing government came in, and of course he's a great friend of Donald Trump. He has dinners in Mar-a-Lago. He's a banana plantation owner with offshore accounts in Panama, so on and so forth. So he loves this ISDS clause because it's his own companies that can sue governments everywhere and make billions of dollars. And he tried to put it back. But to put it back, he can't do that now because it's been locked into the Constitution, right? It requires a constitutional amendment which forced the new right-wing president to call for a referendum on this question. And it was defeated. The Ecuadorian people firmly said, no, we do not want the ISDS clause back. So even without a left government in power, the victory of the left government still stayed in place, right, despite the pendulum shift. And I think the same logic applies for regional integration as well. The example I gave of the medicine price bank that existed under UNASUR, the South American regional organization, that organization is defunct now because you had Bolsonaro come into Brazil and essentially make Brazil exit the treaty, Argentina, Chile exit the treaty. It doesn't have a treaty actually, but exit the organization, and is now struggling to come back on itself. Can you imagine such a thing happening with the European Union? It would be impossible. Every European country, every European parliament has its own flag and has the flag of the European Union. Every institute of the government, police station, wherever you go, this identity that actually we are all together. No matter what, whether we hate Greece, whatever we think of southern Italy, every place, the country flag and the European Union flag. That's what we should have had with UNASUR in every single country, where it isn't just a multilateral initiative, but a real political project where the people of the region were made to be together, forcing a government like Bolsonaro's or Milei's and stopping them in their tracks when they try to exit and say, actually the alliance we want is with Trump and Modi, not with you guys, then the people would have been able to protest. So I think it's a good example, the comparison of why ISDS clause stayed in the Constitution, but UNASUR organization was defeated. That's helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. We're at the end of our two-day conference, and just before we conclude, I want to once again thank Yukthi, LST, BCIS for partnering with IDEAS. We were able to bring these experts, activists, from the Middle East, from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America. And one thing that you may not realize is that the quality and the nature of conversation changes when it's in a global South country. And what we hear from you, what we hear from the panelists is of course about this changing world order, about the need for something new. And in spite of the pessimism, which is of course, it's there, it's a very pessimistic situation, nothing lasts forever. And in this moment, all we can do is continue the work that we're doing in different ways. And this is one of the problems with the left movement as well, right? Because it's not really asking for capital accumulation. It's a different kind of return, which is not for personal gain, which makes it much, much harder. But I think without it, there is nothing. So thanks a lot for being here. Thank you for your engagement. And yeah, see you later then. Thank you.
US hegemony. Congratulations. We look up to you. You all are role models for this cause.
There's also tea and cake waiting for you. So.